Natasha Lloyd-Owen.
Thank you, Town Clerk. My Lord Mayor, climate change is the biggest single threat to everything we all care about. It's the biggest single threat to everything that the City of London Corporation exists to do. Global heating is driving more rainfall and rising sea levels, putting the city at risk of flooding. It's driving hotter and drier summers, putting our country at risk of a tipping point in water scarcity. Extremes of weather are increasingly damaging the infrastructure on which our economies depend, inhibiting the sustainable growth that underpins our very ability to respond to this climate crisis. In 2019, extreme weather events across the globe caused over $100 billion in damage. And globally, last month was the hottest September on record. Make no mistake, this is an emergency of existential proportions, and it requires us to use all of the tools at our disposal to make change happen urgently and on the greatest possible scale. In November last year, the Port Health and Environmental Services Committee agreed that the City of London should not declare a climate emergency without a policy and adequate data in place. Thanks to fellow members and officers who have worked tirelessly in the midst of a pandemic, we now have the opportunity to adopt a climate action strategy today that will give us the foundation from which we can achieve net zero emissions and begin developing climate resilience. That is why today I have brought a motion to declare a climate emergency, to reinforce the climate action strategy and ensure that the scale of climate action is acknowledged and remains at the front of our minds and the minds of future members. The motion before you includes 9 specific commitments, which, if we accept that we face a climate emergency, should be agreeable to this court. Commitment 1. Climate change is an existential threat. We will prioritise it accordingly and register it as a corporate level risk. We now have a baseline and a proposed action plan ready to go. We need to put climate change on a par with other high-rated risks to the corporation, such as COVID-19 and Brexit. Commitments 2 and 3. We agree that the amount of funding in the climate action strategy is a minimum starting point, and we will protect this funding, regardless of changes in funding sources. If we are serious about taking sustained action, the £68 million funding envelope, repeatedly described through the committee process and in the strategy itself as carefully costed and must be guaranteed as a minimum investment over the next 6 years. Commitment 4. The corporation will set interim target dates for achieving the 2040 net zero goal. The corporation's goal for scope 1 and 2 emissions to be net zero by 2027 only relates to 3% of our overall emissions. We must urgently set out ambitious interim target dates to ensure we reach our net zero emissions for scope 3, the 97%, by 2040, and so that we can be held accountable along the way. Commitment 5. We will regularly assess our capacity to increase funding for climate action so as to reach our net zero targets as soon as possible. In light of the IPCC report, we know that there will be serious climate impacts from the global temperature rising by 1.5 degrees. But every fraction of additional warming beyond that will bring worse impacts, threatening lives, livelihoods, and economies. For example, at 1.5 degrees, over 6 million people living in coastal areas vulnerable to sea level rises risk losing their lands and livelihoods. At 2 degrees, that number rises to 10 million more by the end of the century. At 1.5 degrees, the chance of the Arctic losing all of its sea ice in summer will be once a century. At 2 degrees, it will be once a decade. To prevent global temperatures rising above 1.5 degrees, we as a global community need to reduce emissions by 7.6% every year for the next decade. If we don't start to do this now and stick to it, a maximum rise of 1.5 degrees will be out of reach by 2030. Given the importance of the next 10 years, we cannot wait 5 years before reviewing our ability to increase funding and the potential to bring our net zero targets forwards. Commitment 6. We will immediately implement Lord Lisvane's recommendation that green impact assessments accompany every policy or project proposal submitted to a committee. The report on the Climate Action Strategy references a similar commitment in its climate implications section. However, this is not confirmed to start immediately. We need to properly assess the green impact of each project and adopt a climate lens to view all corporation activities from tomorrow. Commitment 7. We will implement a biodiversity action plan by April 2021 in line with the Climate Action Strategy. We are losing biodiversity at a historic rate, with 1 million species out of 8 billion species on Earth threatened with extinction. The Climate Action Strategy does not refer to the corporation's Biodiversity Action Plan 2016 to 20 or any renewed plan. Since submitting this motion, I understand from officers that a renewed Biodiversity Action Plan is due to be implemented by April 2021. This motion commits us to ensuring that happens and that the Climate Action Strategy is aligned with the new Biodiversity Action Plan. Commitment 8. We will meaningfully consult with a wide range of city residents, workers and students. Climate change will have far-reaching consequences for our residents, students, workers and beyond. We are all stakeholders in the health and survival of our planet, and we should commit today to consulting with a diverse range of city communities and demographics on the broader work of the strategy and seeking their contributions wherever possible. We know that representation of those under 25 in the corporation's climate change survey was low. We must ensure that this deficit is rectified, particularly given the disproportionate impact they would face from climate inaction. Commitment 9. If there is evidence for a projected increase in global temperatures of more than 2 degrees, we will revisit and increase our investment in climate resilience before 2030. The Climate Action Strategy will prepare the city to be resilient to a global average temperature rise of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. However, we must recognise that this may not be achieved. According to the UN's 2019 emissions gap report, even if all current unconditional commitments under the Paris Agreement are implemented, temperatures are expected to rise by 3.2 degrees Celsius. The city's current funding envelope does not invest in preparing the city for that level of temperature increase. It's therefore vital that if there is evidence for a projected increase in global temperatures of more than 2 degrees, we commit to revisit and increase our investment in climate resilience before 2030. The declaration of a climate emergency supported by these 9 commitments will strengthen and support the Climate Action Strategy. This is an important opportunity for the corporation to join its voice to the chorus of those across the political spectrum who've already made this declaration, including more than 2/3 of councils across the UK. The more voices that are added to this chorus, the louder it becomes and the harder it will be for those who are sceptical to ignore it. The City of London Corporation holds significant status on the global stage. Today it should send out the message that it both acknowledges the scale of the threat posed by climate change and in the very same meeting has adopted a strategy for action underwritten by £68 million in funding commitments.